So here's my 2008 Volkswagen R32. I have boosted the VR6, but it's been sitting for a few months because it's winter and I don't really drive it in the snow. But I took it for a ride. I let it warm up for a good amount of time and seemed to hesitate a little. I'm guessing there could be some moisture in the fuel or something. I've compression tested this thing a couple times because I built the motor myself. It's got integrated engineering forged rods and JE 8.5-to-1 compression pistons. They're forged, so I want to make sure everything's at its best, that the ring's seated properly. So far it's been pretty good, but like I said, tonight I took it for a ride and it doesn't seem perfect. So I'm going to do a compression leak down test. All my regular compression checks were fine. It's around 143 across all cylinders, which I think is pretty good. There's no deviation really, and that's the main thing. And I think the number is pretty good as well. So we're going to do a leak down test to make sure there's no other issues. So cylinder 6, I'm going to start off with that. I have the oil cap off to vent any excess pressures. So I'm going to hook it up and we'll see what happens. So right now the air is regulated at 70 currently. I'm going to turn it up and see. So I think my air compressor only has around 85 psi, which is why it's not going any higher. But it seems like the numbers are following each other pretty well. There's only about a pound or half a pound difference between this gauge and this gauge. So this is the air going into the cylinder and this is the leakage. It's not leaking very much, so I'd say it's pretty good. I checked cylinder 5 because I had some worries about that cylinder for whatever reason. I bore scoped it a few months ago and I saw something funny in there, but I think it was just a machining mark, so I'm not too worried. But I pretty much got the same results on cylinder 5. So right here, cylinder 6 seems to be right there, and definitely good. Unless people have had problems with these Harbor Freight leak down testers, I don't know, leave me a comment if so. If that's the case, I will try to borrow a Snap-on or Mac Tools one from a friend, but so far so good. Here I'm doing cylinder 4, and now just keep in mind you need to bring the piston to top dead center on whichever cylinder you're testing. If you don't, your valves can be open, most likely will be, and you'll definitely have a huge leak. So you definitely want to make sure you're at top dead center. You could do that by using the mark on the crank, but for me, what I do is I just put a screwdriver in the spark plug hole, obviously not jamming it in there, and turning the engine over by hand. And it's also much easier if you remove all the spark plugs. That way you won't be fighting the compression. So it's pretty easy to turn it over without the spark plugs in, and that's my preferred way of doing it. So let's go with cylinder 4 here. Let's see what happens. There we go. So a little more leakage, but it's only 4 pounds or so, which is really within spec. I think if you're within 10, I think you're in pretty good shape. but obviously check your service manual for the exact spec. I'm not sure what these are, but I think my compression is going to be different on this VR6 because it's got low compression pistons. So I did all the other cylinders in between. I'm not going to waste your time with that, but they yielded the same results. So I just want to also mention you should do this with the engine warm. At least let it idle for like 10 minutes or so. I just happened to take it for a ride, get it up to operating temp, came back, let it cool down, and then I started pulling the plugs out. So we'll see what number 1 does. But I think we're pretty good here. So cylinder number 1 seems to be the leakiest cylinder, but it's still in really good spirits apparently. You know, there's nothing special going on here. Well within spec. And yeah. So if you ever want to check yours, just, you know, get yourself a leak down tester and warm it up. Start pulling your spark plugs and put each of your pistons to top dead center. I know a couple of them are at top dead center at the same time. I believe when I did cylinders 3 and 4, that seemed to be the case, so I didn't have to turn it over, but you could save some time if you figure out which ones are in the same positions. So that's that. Thanks for watching. So I just wrapped up the compression leak down test on my Mark V R32 with the turbo on it. Everything checked out fine. Seems good. I'm just very paranoid of having issues, especially with the bottom end that I put together. You know, but I will say my number 1 cylinder probably had the most leakage. It was probably about 4 psi difference. And funny enough, when I got my JE pistons and rings, when I was gapping the rings, the first ring, and that being one of the compression rings, it, you know, right off the bat, it was a big gap. It was around 22 thousandths. I think factory is like 15 thousandths. But regardless, I was going for a bigger gap anyway. But I checked all the other rings and they didn't have a gap that big. So I said, you know what? Instead of dealing with JE and, you know, calling them and waiting for new rings to be shipped, I just decided to use that 22 thousandths as my my spec that I would gap all my other rings at. I think there's a difference between the top and the middle ring, and I did those, I gapped those accordingly, so they weren't all at 22 thousandths. I forget exactly the number I did, but I based it off that, and go figure, that number 1 cylinder had the most leakage. But it's within spec. I don't think it's a problem at all. I'm not too worried about it. And just another thing, on my last setup, somehow I cracked the original head in a couple of the combustion chambers. There was very small cracks in, I think, 2 or 3 of the cylinders, right up to where the spark plug hole is. And it really wasn't causing me any trouble. I wasn't burning coolant, or if I was, it was very minimal. But I did notice some bubbles in the coolant reservoir, so when I went to disassemble to do the bottom end build that I did, I noticed those cracks. So I had a spare head off a Touareg motor, which is a Mark IV motor. I think it's a BAA, if I'm not mistaken. But I used that head, and since I had deleted the what do you call it? secondary air, EGR, whatever. I didn't need the ports that come on the Mark V heads. So it worked out fine, but I did do a cold leak down test on my spare Touareg motor that had that head on it, and there was a lot of leakage with the valves. So when I, during my build, I basically ran the valves through an ultrasonic cleaner, and then I lapped them. I spent a lot of time lapping them, and then replaced the valve seals, obviously. And this leak down test that I just did confirmed I did a good job on that head. So, you could do a lot of stuff on your own in your garage at home, and it's not very hard. You just be careful. Try not to damage anything, and always look up info before you do these things if you don't know. So far so good with the car. Unfortunately, it's winter here in Connecticut, and I don't like driving around too much unless we get nice days. So hopefully I could, run a couple tanks of gas through the car during the winter. That way I'm not stuck with, varnished fuel or anything like that, because I don't want injector problems or fuel pump problems come springtime when I really want to drive the car. So if you guys have any questions, just leave a comment, or if you have any tips for me, I'm always up for learning something new. I'm no guru by any means, but just trying to help people that might be building an R32 or BR6 car. So hopefully I'll be posting some content for my Mark IV that I bought. It's in rough shape, but it drives, and I gotta do a few things. Hopefully I'll be able to get a video on rebuilding the steering rack on it, resealing it, I should say, because they sell a seal kit, and I want to see if I can get away with doing that rather than buying a whole new rack. So if I, once I do that, hopefully I could post the content that way. Instead of spending the $350 on a new rack, a seal kit's $50, and maybe you can get away with that. So look out for that coming shortly. And yeah, thanks for watching.